Okay, we've all been there, right? You're looking at a lease. It seems pretty basic. You've got the address, the rent, maybe a line about the washing machine.
Hmm.
But have you ever really thought about the problems that can come up from what's not spelled out? From the fuzzy bits around the edges?
Absolutely. It's that assumption, isn't it, that the obvious stuff is actually, well, defined. That's what trips up so many people, renters and landlords.
Yeah.
And when you really dig into it, the core of so many arguments comes down to a really basic question. What? What exactly is being rented here?
Exactly, and that's really what we want to unpack today. We've got some really interesting material looking at why getting those details right in the lease, the exact property, what's in, what's out, is just so vital.
It really is.
So think of this, learner, as your kind of express lane to understanding why these details, the ones that maybe seem small, can make all the difference between things running smoothly and, well, a total nightmare. We're aiming to cut through the jargon and give you the essentials.
Yeah, our goal here is really to show why these specifics, which sometimes feel like, boring legal stuff, are actually the foundation for a clear, predictable rental for everyone.
Okay, so let's start with that feeling, this is easy. Just writing down the address, maybe a couple of things included. Why is that such a gamble, really?
Well, because what seems crystal clear to you might be totally different for the other person. And today, with regulations around tenant rights and landlord duties getting stricter, that vagueness, it's just asking for trouble.
Right.
It leaves gaps, and people fill those gaps with assumptions. And those assumptions could be, well, miles apart.
And it's not just tenants getting the short end of the stick, is it? Landlords can kind of stumble into issues too, especially if they promise things that go beyond their actual property lines, like what's on the title deed.
Precisely. Wanting to attract a good tenant, a landlord might maybe just verbally talk about access to things or make promises they can't actually guarantee, or things that aren't clearly written down.
Like community amenities.
That's a huge one.
Yeah.
Yes. Shared spaces are a classic example where things can get, well, sticky.
Ah, the siren song of the shared pool. Or the gym, maybe parking, even building security. It all sounds great when you're viewing the place, doesn't it?
It really does. But the risk comes when those promises aren't actually nailed down in the lease document. And, importantly, when the landlord hasn't double-checked the rules for those shared areas.
Because those are often managed by someone else.
Exactly. Often it's a community association, a management committee. It's not just up to the individual landlord.
Yeah, the source material we looked at had a really good example of this. A landlord promising 24/7 security, full access to all the communal stuff. Sounds amazing to a tenant, right?
Absolutely. Huge selling point. But then, what if the tenant moves in and finds security only works 9 to 5? Or that getting packages delivered isn't quite how they thought it would be?
They feel cheated.
Understandably, from their point of view, they were promised something specific, and they're not getting it. That feels like the agreement's been broken.
And this is a really key point from the material. Those common areas, security, the gym, access rules, they're often controlled by the building's management committee, not the individual landlord.
Mm-hmm.
So that promise the landlord made, however well-intentioned, might be something they literally don't have the power to deliver on.
That's it, exactly. An individual owner usually doesn't have the final say on those shared resources. So when a landlord, or maybe their agent, makes these big promises without checking the community rules and, crucially, without putting them in the lease, they could be setting themselves up for problems.
And the tenant's complaint, it's going to land right back with the landlord who made the promise.
That's generally how it works, yes.
Okay, let's flip this around. How can a fuzzy definition cause problems from the tenant's perspective? It's not just about what they don't get.
Well, no, definitely not. It's also about what tenants might assume is included. If the lease isn't super clear on the boundaries, physical boundaries, a tenant might reasonably think they can use or even have responsibility for areas that aren't technically part of the deal. Yeah.
And that links back to the landlord's legal duty to keep the place maintained, doesn't it? The actual leased property.
Precisely. The law, housing regulations, they generally say the landlord has to keep the agreed-upon rental space in decent shape.
Mm-hmm.
But what is that agreed-upon space if the lease is vague?
That's where tenant expectations might start to expand.
Exactly. They might assume more falls under the landlord's job list than was perhaps intended.
The example about the little courtyard is perfect for this. Say there's a small outdoor space, maybe not officially on the property deed, but the landlord casually says, oh yeah, feel free to hang laundry out there.
Right. So the tenant naturally thinks, okay, this courtyard is part of my rental.
Mm-hmm.
Then maybe the paving gets cracked or a fence starts leaning. The tenant, logically, thinks the landlord should fix it because, you told me I could use this space.
But if the lease never explicitly included it,
You've got a potential dispute, a disagreement waiting to happen, with the tenants feeling the landlord isn't holding up their end of the bargain, even if informally.
so it really all boils down to needing absolute clarity. Define everything. The source material really hammers this home. Spell out exactly which areas, inside and out, and what equipment is part of the deal.
Absolutely. The more specific you are in the lease, the less wiggle room there is for different interpretations later on.
Hmm.
It just heads off so many potential fights before they even start.
And one really practical tip from the article is attaching the property title deed right to the lease itself. That seems pretty solid for defining boundaries.
It is. It's a really good idea.
Mm.
Including the deed gives you that official legal map of the property lines and the rights that go with it. It just removes a huge potential source of confusion about, how far the rental actually extends.
What about situations where you're only renting, say, part of a building, like just one apartment or one floor?
Yeah, good question. In those cases, the article really emphasizes using a detailed floor plan or some kind of layout diagram.
Attached to the lease.
Attached right to the lease, yes. It needs to clearly show exactly which bits the tenant has the exclusive right to use. Which rooms, maybe a specific balcony, perhaps even outlining any shared internal spaces if that applies. It just leaves no doubt.
Let's go back to that risk of over-promising about community stuff, like the security example. The source had a real-world case that really highlighted the dangers.
Yes, that's definitely worth revisiting. It's a really common area for problems. The example was about a property manager trying to get tenants in who put a guarantee of 24-hour security into the actual lease agreement.
Right, but as we said, things like security schedules in a condo or apartment complex, that's usually decided by the collective management committee, not one owner or their agent.
Exactly.
Eh.
So in this real case, the homeowners association or management committee decided later on to cut back on security hours, maybe to save money, whatever the reason,
Which instantly put the landlord.
in a really tough spot, potentially breaching their own lease agreement because of that promise their agent made about 247 security.
And a really important point the article made was that in this kind of situation, neither the landlord nor the tenant can necessarily go after the management committee for compensation.
Generally, no. The committee is usually just doing its job, managing the community according to its rules and budget.
They're acting within their authority.
Right. Their decisions about common services are usually binding on everyone. So the liability for that broken promise in the lease, it lands right on the property manager who put it in there without having the actual power to guarantee it long term.
Wow, so they could be on the hook to both the landlord and the tenant.
Potentially, yes.
But
It highlights the responsibility of agents and managers to only promise what's actually within the landlord's control and clearly documented.
so the big takeaway here seems to be, especially if you're renting in a place with shared management, stick to the facts. Define the scope based on the landlord's actual legal rights. Be crystal clear.
That's the core message. Detailed disclosure, clear written terms, using supporting documents like the deed or accurate floor plans.
Oh,
It's not just red tape.
It's about setting clear expectations up front. It protects both the landlord and the tenant, and honestly, it just leads to a much less stressful rental experience for everyone involved.
It really does make you stop and think, doesn't it? How many other agreements in life might have these kinds of hidden traps if we don't clearly define what's actually included? So here's something to ponder, learner. What other parts of life could really benefit from the kind of detailed clarity we've seen is so crucial for a simple rental lease?